Hello, fabulous friends and fans. Welcome to your Mars special horoscope for the Mars retro season taking place in 2016. I am your astrologer, Nadiya Shah. Thank you for being here. Mars will enter shadow at the 17th of February and will move forward, go retro, and then move forward again and leave shadow at the end of August. So this whole period of time is going to be, is going to be inspired by what is symbolized in the sky with this Mars retrograde season. Anytime a major important planet at that goes retro, and especially anytime that a planet that isn't used to going backwards so much, like Mars, goes backwards about once every 2 years or so. And when that happens, it does tend to denote an important time of understanding our own power, and especially our own power to create change in our own lives, to understand ourselves more deeply, and to accept and surrender as a way of gaining power. To me, I see Mars very much as what is called the serenity prayer or the serenity affirmation, which is grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I do believe that that's what Mars is about, and that whole part, especially the wisdom part of it, is amplified when Mars goes retro. And I think this becomes especially true because Mars will be retro in the sign of Scorpio. And as I look at all the interesting things that Mars is set to do and what will be taking place over this Mars retrograde season, a few highlight moments, standout moments. To me, this says really all over it, it says owning our power, understanding where we don't need to carry the weight of the world, or we don't need to really carry something that we don't have power over. There's something very spiritual about surrender. And there's also something very spiritual about owning our power to move our lives in the direction that we desire to go. And this is going to be part of the learning that all of us are going to be going through in our own unique ways. Mars represents, yes, serenity prayer and that wisdom part of it amplified with the retrograde. Mars is also what it is that gets our attention. What is it that moves us, that drives us, and how it is that we can empower ourselves. So Mars gives us a lot of tools out there. It helps us to take action, and it helps us to take action from a place of self-knowledge. And that really is when Mars is at its best. Most of us know Mars in modern Western astrology as impulsive, okay, and takes action without necessarily thinking first, and thinks of this as an archetype that has to do with aggression. And that is one part of it. But a more evolved Mars, a deeper understanding of Mars, can help elevate and evolve this energy, and can help us to use this energy very much to our advantage. So it isn't just that we're having buttons pushed and we're reacting, which is how, for some people, Mars tends to play out. And I think that this, sort of reaction, stimulus reaction, is less likely when Mars is retrograde. And that's another thing I really love about Mars retrograde, is that it helps us to have that moment to think, to have that breather, to consider what it is that we're about to do. And that split second, that little action really can make all the difference between doing something that is in alignment with your best self, right? Your higher sense of self and your higher sense of wisdom, and taking action that, afterwards you kind of go, oh my God, what was I thinking? What was I doing there? Like, that's if you're lucky, right? If you're lucky, you end up saying that to yourself. So if you think about the glyph of Mars, Mars is a circle, right? And it has an arrow arising from it. And that arrow is pointed outwards. So the circle is wholeness. The circle is self-knowledge. It's knowing that you are this independent person who can think for yourself, who can act on behalf of yourself, and can know something about who you are and know something about what is true for you. There's the circle of wholeness that understands that ultimately it is about, and especially in Western astrology, so much of our experience and so much of the philosophical understanding of why planets are interpreted the way that they are, and how charts are calculated in Western astrology is based on this understanding of ourselves as being the observer. So we as observer are determining our experience. We're perceiving our experience, we're interpreting our experience, and it is based on that and the action that we take that we sort of create momentum, if you will, in our lives. And so that circle of wholeness is about having the self-knowledge to make those choices of your actions and of your reactions consciously, from a place of knowing who you are and being at peace with that. Being, I think about one of the great things that it's been said again and again, one of the great things about getting older is that you get to know yourself a little bit better, and there's a greater level of acceptance that comes with that as well. And I like to call it, you become more self-possessed. And it isn't, something spooky or witchy. It doesn't have to be unless you want it to be. But what it means essentially is that it is about knowing that you are okay. Knowing that you are all right, knowing that you can accept where it is that you're strong, that you can ask for help, where it is that you're not so strong, and you can work with who you are in this lifetime instead of trying to be something else, instead of trying to be something that maybe either you're not or maybe you've been trying really hard to be. So that's one of the greatest things I believe about getting older, is that you sort of connect to that knowing that you had in very early life. And that's also part of what Mars represents. Mars is our very first survival instinct. It is how it is that we learned to navigate our earliest environments, like before we could speak, that early. And it speaks to what kind of emotions we got used to feeling as very young children. Again, before we could speak. And so what often happens in life is that if you're really young and you grow up in a particular atmosphere, whether it's culturally, could be part of it, but particularly in your immediate atmosphere, and the people around you sort of, we sort of have these emotional states that we dwell in, okay? So some people are lucky, they grow up in homes that, the emotional energy tends to be really calm. Other people, not so much, right? It can really vary. Sometimes it can be, it can go one way or the other. And it's not that it's maybe someone else, maybe our primary caregivers tried to create a certain environment. However, it's not just about that. It's not just about the environment that our primary caregivers try to cultivate, but it's also about the energy that we bring to that environment and how we interact with that environment that determines some of the emotions that we get used to feeling very early on. And it is those emotions that we start to associate with love. And as we get older, we tend to associate certain feelings with desire. And Mars is also our own desire. It's what it is that we are attracted to, really. What it is that we feel energetically moved towards, whether it's in another person, but primarily in terms of how it is that you feel. So, for example, if you grew up in an environment where the energy wasn't always calm, then when you meet somebody and you sense that, oh, the energy isn't really calm, and this isn't a conscious process at all, right? Mars is very immediate, right? Mars is, you feel it, you know it. And, you sort of grow up and you get used to feeling certain emotions, and then you meet somebody and they are giving out that vibe, they're letting you know in their own way that they are triggering those same emotions in you, right? That they resonate with those early emotions. And that's what we find ourselves move towards. That's what we find ourselves attracted to. this, of course, is for a lot of us, and especially when we're teenagers, it's a very unconscious process. But as you get older, you come to realize that you can actually choose what it is that you're going to be moved towards. You can actually choose, and this is actually an idea that goes back. I mean, it was articulated by lots of philosophers going way, way back. And philosophers have talked about how we can sort of decide on what love is going to be and decide what it is that is going to excite us, right? What it is that is going to get that energetic reaction to us. And, sometimes, I think about, for example, this is really exploring the symbolism of Mars here, but, have you ever met somebody who is like really attracted to like bad boys or bad girls? And what makes that person bad is that they trigger a chaotic energy, right? That's what makes that person bad. They're unpredictable, unreliable, and they trigger chaotic energy. That's the definition of someone who's a bad boy or bad girl, if that's the reaction they're causing within you. And chances are that if you find yourself very attracted to these types of people, then chances are it could have been in the earlier part of life, before you learn to speak, you kind of got used to feeling some emotions that also were kind of similar. And because of our earliest environments, we start to associate the emotions we get used to dwelling in with love. As you get older, and especially as you start going out there into the world of attraction and into the world of connecting with other people, into the world of understanding who it is, what kind of person you're attracted to, you will find yourself having experiences. And if you're at that place now, you can reflect back, maybe having some experiences that were hearkening to some of those very early emotions. But of course, as we get older, we tend to find, depending on who you are, right? Some people can keep doing that with the same person sometimes. You can keep doing that for lifetimes on end. And then for a lot of us, I think for more of us now than ever, who go through that phase, which is actually a very common phase, I will say, you go through that phase and you sort of say, okay, yeah, this isn't really working for me. I'm like, that emotional roller coaster gets tiring and it gets boring. That's the thing too, that people don't always acknowledge, that emotional roller coaster, it isn't just about it tires you out, it wears you out. You start feeling like you're not being respected. You start feeling like you're working way too hard for someone to love you. And these can be some of the symptoms of liking that proverbial bad boy or bad girl. But there's another layer to it, which is about understanding that you sort of get to a point where you're like, okay, this is like young, this is boring, this is childish, this is not who I want to be. And when you get to that place and you realize that you can decide who you want to be, and even if you don't believe it just yet, you can act like who it is that you want to be and know that you're going to get there. Know that you can find yourself drawn to people, right? And having reactions to people who are good for you, who respect you, who are healthy, who engage you on a level of where you are. And that doesn't always mean what you think it means. Sometimes I get these messages from people in the astrology world and in other, sort of new age spiritual communities. And they say, I can't find a guy who's like me. I want somebody who gets it, who gets astrology, who gets spirituality, who's into yoga. And then I can't tell you how many times I have people ordering personalized horoscopes, men who order personalized horoscopes who say, I want to meet somebody and I can't meet somebody. And they are like yoga instructors and they're astrologers themselves. So it isn't about that. It isn't that there aren't people out there who are going to get you at whatever level you're at. I mean, just go to any astrology conference. You'll meet lots of people out there who are just like you. But Mars is more about something more essential. So when you're saying that, okay, I want to meet somebody who is, in the new age world. Well, ultimately, that part of you, how do you understand that part of you is going to be really important, because at the end of the day, I think Mars is a very big factor in what you are drawn to and what it is that you want. And there is this balance to be achieved between Mars and your moon, which is why when I get to the horoscope section, I would really encourage you to consider watching not only for your sun sign, but particularly for your moon sign as well, because I think the moon is hugely important where it comes to attraction and where it comes to what you are drawn to and why and whom. So these are some things to consider about what Mars represents in your chart, but then also transiting Mars. How is it going to awaken these very themes in your own life? When Mars goes retrograde, if you are a person who has Mars retrograde in your chart, or for those of you who are more advanced students of astrology who know your progressed Mars, if your progressed Mars is retrograde, it is a time when Mars does retrograde. It's a time where if otherwise you might feel that, and this I've also found is true for people who have Mars in the more emotional, energetic houses. So if you have Mars in your natal chart, regardless of sign, if you have Mars in your 4th house, your 8th house, or your 12th house, I've also found this to be true. It sort of takes on a little bit of a Mars retrograde in the natal chart kind of quality. And so if you have Mars retro or in one of these spiritual, quieter houses in your chart, then Mars retrograde tends to be a really good time, because when Mars is retrograde in a natal chart or is in one of these quieter houses, it tends to represent someone, now all else being equal, right? If that Mars is having all kinds of squares with other planets, squaring Uranus, squaring Pluto, squaring the sun, right? Maybe not so much. Maybe you're not as held back. But in general, when you have Mars in one of these placements, it tends to mean that that part of you that goes from feeling or stimulus, goes from stimulus to action, you have that pause in between. And in early life, it can like suck sometimes, okay? Like if I can just say it like that, be very direct about it, because I have found that people with these types of placements, you look back and you go, oh my God, why didn't I say something? Why didn't I do something? Oh, I could have said this. You know, it's like after the fact that you realize you have the perfect response, you know? It's like after the moment has passed that you realize, oh, you could have got your revenge. But the thing is that when you have Mars placed like this, in one of the quieter houses or retro in the natal chart, you're not generally going to be the kind of person who is inclined towards doing things like getting revenge. You're going to be much more inclined towards understanding how to direct your energy wisely and understanding slowly but surely, it does take a little bit of time, but understanding how to use this energy to your advantage. And one of the time frames that makes it most clear how to use this energy to your advantage is Mars retrograde season. So if you've got one of these placements, then definitely Mars retrograde season is that much more important for you. But what tends to happen is that not only is action easier if you've got one of these placements that I mentioned, but also there's a greater level of acceptance that, you know, yeah, you're not going to just act like, you know, go. Someone says jump and you do it. You're not inclined to do that. You need a moment to think before you act. You want some time to consider your options. And there tends to be less frustration with that process and a greater acceptance and a greater sense of, wow, I really like this part of me. I can work with this part of me. For everyone else out there, this can be a time of reflection. The textbooks do say that this can be a time when you start to feel a little bit like limited in your actions. You feel like you can't necessarily just say what you want to say and just sort of, you know, be in the moment and exert yourself as easily as you did before. But I think that these Mars retrograde periods are so important because they help us to understand what it is that is going to allow us to take action and allow us to feel that we're doing it with a measure of integrity, that we're doing it with a measure of self-knowledge, self-understanding, to ensure that we aren't just reacting to stimulus, that it isn't that the world is determining what we feel and how it is that we behave, but that we are able to decide who we are. We are able to decide what our triggers are going to be, what buttons are pushed or not. And we are going to decide ultimately what it is that moves us to action. But also, if you're one of those people who's been feeling like, gosh, I wish I knew what I could do to empower myself. I wish I knew how to move forward from any given situation, especially a situation that has felt frustrating, then Mars retrograde can really help you to understand the finer points, understand your own motivations, and tap into a deeper motivation and a deeper understanding of just what you need to do. Mars is action. What do you need to do to move yourself in a positive direction? I think that Mars retrograde can be an amazing time, a spiritual time, and this Mars retrograde in general has truth written all over it, all over it. So there are several sort of signposts, like standout moments that I do want to mention to you that I think are going to be imperative as we move into the Mars retrograde season. So let's take it one at a time. I might be moving around just a little bit, but making connections. So for example, Mars shadow. Mars enters shadow on the 17th of February. And it will be Mars that returns to this very point in the sky, the 23rd degree of Scorpio. Mars will return to this place in the last days of June and the first days of July. And so these dates are connected because Mars is going to retrograde back and hang out where he was when he first started going into shadow. So this marks a very important moment. So as I said earlier, make sure you're taking notes, but it is going to be, especially if you find yourself really having some powerful realizations. And if you're a student of astrology and you know that you've got especially a chart point, if you've got an important chart point like your ascendant or your midheaven or your part of fortune, if you've got one of the important chart points at 23 degrees or near 23 degrees of Scorpio, then you definitely want to pay attention to this time, because the first, might come along and go a little subtly, but there will be no doubt once we get to late June and into July as to what the learning is for you, what the understanding is. Where is it that the universe wants you to understand yourself more deeply, to take action more consciously and move yourself forward, to start taking action so that you can create momentum to move towards the life that you desire, to move towards the type of emotional experiences that you desire. So what kind of emotional states do you want to be in? Do you want to dwell in? And what is it ultimately that is true for you? What is power to you? These are going to be big themes that come up for all of us. Truth and power and wisdom and knowledge. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. So you do want to watch right around these dates. That is going to be one of the important points, if you will. The other important degree that you need to know if you're a student of astrology is the 8th degree of Sagittarius, because that is the degree where Mars will go retrograde. Okay, so Mars will go retrograde in April. I'll be here to talk about in the weekly horoscopes, but Mars will go retrograde in April. And when Mars goes retro, so Mars will, right around the 6th of March, enter the sign of Sagittarius while in shadow. And as we move forward and we enter April, it is going to be Mars that begins to go retrograde right around the 8th degree. So what does this mean? Well, this means that if you were born right around the 1st or the 2nd of any given month, this is going to be a time you really, really want to watch. So you want to watch what it is that is happening in your life right around the middle of April. Okay, so the middle of April, you want to watch what's happening in your life. And the other time that Mars will return to this place will be as Mars is leaving shadow. And that's happening the week of the 17th of August. And that's going to be a really important week. And I do think that those of you who have an important placement in this place, okay, if you know your chart, You've got an important placement right around the 8th degree of any sign, first of all. Secondly, the 8th degree of any mutable sign, the 8th degree of any fire sign. And then if you have like a chart point at the 8th degree of Sagittarius, or a planet at the 8th degree of Sagittarius, it is going to be that much more an important Mars retrograde season for you. And I think that it's more important for those of you who are who have one of these placements, these Sag placements. This Mars retrograde season is going to be more important for you than the people who have 23 degrees Scorpio, things happening in their chart. So the 23 degree Scorpio speaks to those people who were born right around the middle of the month. So smack dab, if you were born right in the middle of a month, so right around the 15th of a month. That is where this energy is going to be especially important for you, especially pronounced for you. You want to watch those days that I first gave. So 17th of February, and then late June and early July. Those are going to be the more important dates for you. But of all these dates, I think it's the Sag dates. I think it's those 8 degree dates that are going to feel this Mars retrograde season more powerfully, especially as it finishes. I mean, talk about a cherry on top, but we will get there. So Mars will enter shadow, and then will enter the sign of Sagittarius. Now, there's going to be one moment, sort of like a few actually, but one of the hot point moments, one of the elevated moments that I think is going to be very important is going to occur the week of the Mars, or rather the week of the equinox, the spring equinox. So the week of the 21st and going forward from there. So right around that time, there are a few very interesting things taking place that I think are going to, in some ways, in important ways, kind of activate this energy and help us to understand which way the wind is blowing, which way things are moving for us. One of the highlight moments, one of the important moments that is set to take place with this Mars retrograde season is going to occur right around the spring equinox. Now, this is going to be important for a few different things. One is we are going to be having an eclipse, a lunar eclipse, and this lunar eclipse will be speaking to Mars, newly in the sign of Sagittarius. With Jupiter in the sign of Virgo, I really like this energy because I think it focuses in on the details. It's not like we get very caught up in ideology or rhetoric, but we're really focusing in on what it is that, whether it's the job requires, right? What it is that meaningful change in our own lives and also in our collective as well. The energy of Sag is very interested in the collective. What does that actually require? And having that sense of hope, yes, but also a sense of clarity as well as to how it is that you are going to get there. So this is going to represent an important time. The sun will be speaking in harmony with Mars, and Mercury will be speaking to Mars as well. So this just adds to that level of awareness. Whenever there is eclipse season, and eclipses are going to play an important part in this particular retrograde season. When there is an eclipse, some people say, eclipses eclipse the past. I like to think that eclipses essentially are about bringing you back into alignment with a higher vision for your life, bringing you back into alignment with a path that moves you towards greater love and greater wisdom. And how does it do that? Well, look, what are eclipses? Eclipses involve the nodes, and the nodes of the moon. The nodes speak to this very pathway, as I spoke about in the North Node special videos that I did as part of, it was like the early days of Synchronicity University, before it was called Synchronicity University, but part of that certainly. It was those North Node videos that explain in more depth the symbolism and the importance of the nodes and how it is ultimately that they are about aligning you with that intention that the soul sets for this lifetime. So when there is an eclipse in general, when there's an eclipse, and I've spoken about this in other videos as well, when there is an eclipse, depending on how far off that path you are, will depend on how dramatically you are brought back. And depending on where this eclipse takes place in your chart, right, in your unique birth chart, if you're a student of astrology, you'll know, right? If you see an eclipse coming, and this eclipse is happening in the very early degrees of Libra, 3 degrees of Libra. So you know, if you're a student of astrology, like what is 3 degrees in your chart? If there are any planets that are, or any chart placements that are mutable 3 degrees, you're going to pay attention. Any placements in your chart, any planets in your chart that are at 3 degrees of air or 3 degrees of fire are going to be helpful. And this ultimately says also that, you know, if you have your sun at the very beginning of your sign, so let's say you were born right around the 23rd to the 25th of your sign, then that eclipse is going to speak especially powerfully to you. But it's not only because it's an eclipse, but also because of Mars and the important role that Mars is going to be playing, especially in this first part of the year, and how it is that this eclipse is going to participate in that. And when an eclipse is harmoniously placed with Mars, it does tend to represent action. It represents change that is actually happening, like you being empowered, knowing what you need to do, and actually taking steps to do it, to move your life in the direction that you desire it to go. It's like having that realization. And this is a lunar eclipse at that. So it'll be like, you know what is done. You will know what is over. You're like, okay, I am so beyond that. I am so done with that. So lunar eclipses, as will take place right around the equinox, are about ending, they're about closures, but within that, and it tends to be something, you know, if you're living consciously, you see it coming. It's like a full moon, but like 25 times more powerful. However, if you're not, you know, if you're sort of just going along in life, not necessarily thinking about your connection to everyone and everything, not necessarily paying attention or listening to what your environment is trying to tell you, then when that eclipse comes along, and especially if it is on a very important point in your chart, you are really going to wake up. You are going to realize in sometimes very sudden ways that what has to change, what has got to change. And if you find yourself wanting that change, but it doesn't seem to be happening right around the equinox, just wait a month and you will get there. And that is because a month later, we are going to have a series of events take place right around the same time. So we're looking at right around April the 16th. A series of events are going to take place that are going to be incredibly important. So April 16th, right around April 16th. So here's what's happening right at that time. So on the 17th of April, Mars will stand still and go retro. In less than 24 hours, Pluto will stand still and go retro. This is incredibly important. This is one of the most and more powerful symbols that we are going to have. It's not the only one in these days, but both of these planets are the rulers of the sign of Scorpio. Both of these planets. The ancient ruler of Scorpio is Mars. The modern ruler of Scorpio is Pluto. So we have this energy, very strong Scorpion energy, magnified for us all. And to me, Scorpio energy, especially if it is approached consciously, it is an energy of honesty. It's an energy of like seeing through the superfluous and getting to the core, right? It's about being able to see through the fog, let's say, right? There's a lot of words you can put in there. But it's about being able to see through all of that, see through what doesn't matter, see through the illusions, and really know what is true, like really get to the essence. Now, this tends to be, and because we're in an election year, I will say, and I will give a little bit of a heads up, this tends to be like this, as I look at this, and this is happening, Sagittarius, the energy of Sagittarius is being very amplified, and the Scorpion energy being very amplified. You add to that a Capricorn, Pluto in Capricorn. being amplified. And because I know in the US there is an election season taking place, this is going to be a very important week. So we're looking at mid-April, very important week, where we are going to see people bow out. We are going to see people sort of accept, okay, this campaign is over, and bow out. We are going to also see where it is that maybe some illusions have been. This is really going to get to the core. This is really going to get to the truth. But this is also going to represent, for some people, like a real power move. And what I mean by that is, when this energy is not elevated and it's not enlightened, it can lend itself to manipulation, right? And like, as they say, like playing dirty, if you will. But I don't think that there's going to be any getting away with that. And the reason that I say that is, we are going to have, at the same time, we are going to have Venus doing some really interesting things. So Venus will be speaking in harmony with Saturn, meeting Uranus in the sky, and activating the Uranus-Pluto square. So we'll be speaking with Pluto as well. And this is all happening in the days leading up to a full moon in the sign of Scorpio. This Scorpio full moon should be a game changer in a lot of areas of life, personally, especially. I mean, this whole week to me is saying truth comes out. Some will love it, some might not, but this is going to be when a lot of things just, and in some cases, very surprisingly, very dramatically, it's like, okay, this is the truth of where you are. This is, you pull the curtain back and what is actually there, like actually looking the Wiz, the Wizard of Oz, right? That's an example from their reference to that. This is actually looking at where it is that maybe we haven't been completely honest with ourselves, with others, and collectively as well. This is going to be a time when, if there's, been any examples of people who've sort of weaved a very, careful web, this is where like the holes are going to start to be exposed. So we should notice that collectively, especially where it comes to things like Mars is in Sagittarius. So this has to do with ideology. This has to do with religious figures. This has to do with political figures as well. So these are the kinds of places where we'll start to see some really interesting new information, if you will, that ends up changing perceptions, and in some cases changing perceptions in very clear ways, very clear-cut ways. Personally, this is about letting go of the weight of the world, realizing what matters and what doesn't, realizing what your truth really is, and being committed to living that truth. Now, normally, Mars is very introspective, and even the Scorpion energy, right? It has a strategic quality to it. However, with Venus meeting Uranus and having all the conversations that Venus is, I mean, this is very much about what before was so pretty. All of a sudden, as they say, all that glitter is not gold. That's what is going to come out for a lot of us in our individual lives. And as I said, we'll see collective examples of this as well. The other important moment that we want to watch is early May. Early May, Jupiter will stand still in the sky and go direct. Now, Jupiter is the ruling planet of, Jupiter being the ruling planet of the sign of Sagittarius, Mars being in the sign of Sagittarius, is going to make this an important turning point, an important change in terms of feeling that shift of energy, feeling like, okay, now we know what to do to move forward. Jupiter in the sign of Virgo is all about the details. It's all about, getting down to the nitty gritty of things. And with Mars, there's an element there of how do we act intelligently? How do we behave smartly? And it is going to be Jupiter moving direct in early May that is going to show the way forward. And as we progress 3 weeks into May, this is where some really notable changes start to happen. So what we are going to have 3 weeks into May is Mars will move back into the sign of Scorpio, And essentially what Mars is going to do is going to stand across the sky from the sun. And Mars will be intimately involved in a full moon that is occurring right around that time, just before we get 3 weeks in. So about a week or so before we get right to this particular opposition, this particular sun standing across Mars and Mars then moving back into Scorpio, we're going to have a full moon that happens with the Mars very close to it. So what this says is emotions running high. That's what this says to me. And especially if it's emotions around another person, they're going to especially run very high. What we do want to watch at this time is to be kind and patient. Is always, I mean, I think that kindness is like the balm that makes the entire experience of being a human being on the planet, and actually for everyone on the planet, makes that whole experience just goes so much better, so much smoother, so much calmer, so much everything good, right? Kindness is just really it, that little moment before, we act in a way that we might regret. That little moment that lets us say, okay, how would I feel? That empathy. So we're going to be called, especially those who choose to live a little bit more consciously, be called to be aware. This could be a time also when there's a lot of rhetoric going around, okay? Again, this is Sag energy. There's political, religious kind of energy that can go along with this. So what we want to understand, and I do believe, and I think that's part of the gift of the Sagittarian energy, is to understand that there are certain truths, right? Like scientific truths, and that's awesome, and that's there. But then there's a lot of things that are more like spiritual truths, and there are a lot of things that are true, but they are relative. And they may be true for you, but not necessarily for other people. So this is going to be that moment when we get to understand that, we get to accept that. And what I also think is the great opportunity with this time as Mars moves back into the sign of Scorpio is, even if we see, rhetoric very high as we are at the 21st and the 22nd of May, very soon that energy will give way to Mars moving back into Scorpio. And Mars moving into Scorpio is really good, especially to happen at that time, because Mars moving into Scorpio is very strategic. It's very smart. It's very understanding of all the complexities involved in any given situation and the smartest action to take. That's what Mars retro in Scorpio, Mars in Scorpio in general, but especially Mars retrograding back into Scorpio, what's the smartest action to take? What's the smartest way forward from here? As we move forward, so the next turning point is going to be one that I already mentioned, and that is Mars standing still and going direct at the very end of June. So we'll be feeling this energy in the last days of June, first days of July. 23 degrees of Scorpio are going to be feeling this energy, very much so. And this is going to be a time energy moves forward. That's what it comes down to. We move forward. We are moving forward. And this is especially true with moving forward with a strategic plan of action in any area of life. But also this has to do with, it's almost as if when I look at this, it's like, okay, we've seen the truth. We've seen what actually is. We've seen how and what it is we need to understand about ourselves. What's really essential? Where is it that we've sort of bought into illusions? Where is it that we've told ourselves that the superfluous, the superficial, right? Things like how you look, the names you give yourself, and the clothes you wear, right? How are these things even relevant to what really matters, what's really worth working towards, what real power is? because I think that that is going to be a big part of this retrograde season, is defining power for yourself and realizing that true power is not in the superficial. It's not in money or looks or any of those ways in which people will tell you that that's the pathway to get power. But it's actually something much more personal. It's actually this resolve to be true to yourself, to know who you are, and to act from that truth honestly is a big part of this lesson, I think, for a lot of us out there. We're going to also see public examples of this. I do believe that we should notice, it should be right around this time, I will say, Mars is, and Mars, Scorpio, this energy, this to me says that we should see at least one very notable celebrity come out right around this time. So we do want to watch what's taking place, especially in the early part of July. And then, of course, as we move forward, we are going to have, as we're moving forward, Mars marching forward. As we get towards the very end of July into August, Mars moves into Sagittarius. Mars moves into sign of Sagittarius. And then before the month is over, as we move towards the end of August, Mars will leave shadow, thereby ending the whole retrograde season. But it's not just going to go out with a whimper. Actually, and it's not going to go out right at the time that the shadow is over, because just as the shadow is over, 3 weeks into August, the shadow ends. And immediately after that week, right? That week we have Mars meeting Saturn in the sky and speaking with Neptune, basically activating the Saturn-Neptune square that's been happening and will continue to happen into this year. With that particular Saturn-Neptune square that's taking place, Mars coming along and activating this is a big wake-up call. And it's a big decision on our part as to, okay, now we've come to explore and consider what kind of rhetoric, what kind of speech is healthy and helpful and what isn't, in terms of what are the best ways to move forward for all of us, and particularly in light of making a plan that is meaningful and that allows meaningful change to take place, that allows true power to settle in, as opposed to displays of power that sometimes people can get caught up in, unfortunately. And this is going to be our chance to collectively decide, personally in our own lives, but also collectively as well, to decide what it is that we are now going to give energy to, so that we can, and I believe this is going to be the case, this is really going to be about understanding that there may be work to be done to amp up the power of that Neptune. But in this conversation, as I spoke about before in a special video, in this conversation between Saturn and Neptune, Neptune is the more powerful player. Neptune wins. And I do think that this Mars is going to strengthen that resolve. Might give us some examples to help us to really understand that truth about ourselves, to help us to say, yeah, you know what? I am committed to being part of the Neptunian energy. Even when that Saturn in Sagittarius gets really loud, which it might right around that time, even if it decides to get loud, it doesn't matter. We are going to walk with that Neptune. So that will be a very pivotal moment in the square playing out, and how that moment plays out will lend itself to the final resolution of this conversation, this final exact moment of this conversation between Saturn and Neptune that is set to take place in the month of September. So lots happening there. It won't be over until actually we get to the very end of August. that's when we really will be feeling like, okay, now we're moving into new territory. Now we're starting something different. Now we're taking a whole other action. We've resolved what we needed to. We've accepted what we needed to. But also, I do think a lot of people are going to be saying, wow, a lot of meaningful change was made. And there's a tremendous amount of personal reward that comes from appreciating that. Well, thank you so much for watching the introduction to this Mars special horoscope. I'm so grateful for it. As you know, if you've been watching me, or if this is the first time that you're seeing me, welcome. Thank you for being here. If you've been watching me for a while, thank you so much. I know some people have been watching me for years, and some of you maybe newer friends and fans, but I'm so grateful for this moment. As you may know, if you've been on my site, if you've watched any of my horoscopes, I very, very much believe that the universe is wise and loving. And this is the intention behind everything that I put into the world. Everything I put into the world is about affirming that the universe is wise and loving. And my hope is that by watching this video, by watching your horoscope, you get that hope and that inspiration, and you too feel a sense of affirmation that the universe is wise and loving. And I think that this coming Mars retrograde season will show us just that. Sometimes the very thing that makes you feel frustrated, the very thing that feels like it is just testing your patience, ends up being the very thing that frees you, ends up being the very thing that reveals to you the truth of who you are, the truth of what you really want, and the courage to walk that path. This can be a time when a lot of us, and collectively we'll see this, personally we'll see this as well. However you understand bravery, we should see some very inspiring examples of that. But I think that all of us in our own way are walking a very brave path. It takes a lot of bravery to be a human being and to be sensitive, especially to feel things, to choose to be conscious, to want to walk a path of greater awareness and greater consciousness. It does take a certain commitment, and certainly it does take the bravery, the willingness to be open to the world, to be open to inspiration, and to trust yourself on that level. Not always the easiest thing to do, but I think Mars moving through Scorpio, moving through Sag, and all the wonderful things that Mars will be doing is going to be a huge part of helping us to tap into that personal bravery, and actually will be part of what helps to propel us further into the new age. As 2012 ended, the Mayans prophesied so many years ago, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the end of 2012, December 21st, 2012, will be the end of one age and the beginning of a new age for humanity. And I do think that what takes place with this Mars retrograde, how it's speaking to different power players in the sky, is going to be part of that activation, part of what propels us forward into our future, and part of what helps more of us to step into the new age in our personal lives. And I do believe that that new age is going to be characterized by more of us knowing and more of us wanting to be part of that growing affirmation, that growing understanding, that growing desire to put that energy in the world that affirms that the universe is wise and loving. You being here allows me to live that mission. And for that, I am truly so grateful. So how all this wonderful stuff that Mars is going to do, this Mars retro season speaks to you in your sign, is coming up right now.